Good afternoon, everybody. Can you hear me? Go ahead and hit us with a yes in the chat, a thumbs up, something of that sort. Got thumbs up on the video over here. Welcome, Tosh. Got some thumbs up reactions. Okay, great. Um, Welcome. Thank you for joining us. I know Dr. Reed is setting up. Gabriel Singer is here with us as well. Let me just say that this meeting is being recorded and an edited version will be made available on the ARCJS YouTube channel. Please don't let this discourage you from participating today, as the published version will not include any participants' images, voices, or identifying material. So please feel free to turn your cameras on with confidence that your face isn't going to be on our YouTube channel. Except, of course, the three handsome devils that you see on the flyer. We're going to be on that shit. With that stuff being said, what's up, y'all? I see some familiar names on the participants list. I see some familiar faces. And let me say that this is going to be a dope ass fucking meeting. Some of my favorite colleagues are on the call here with us. Some of my favorite comrades from my work in community counseling are here. Of course, we got our all-star students in the house. Shout out to you, students. I also see one or two enemies among us. So let me just say that I'm down to keep it civil and professional if you are. I hope each of you will join us for some of our community building events in the fall, where you'll be able to interact with each other a lot more. But as we at this point have less than 16 minutes remaining in this event, let's get to what was advertised. This call is divided into fourths. I got 15 minutes to frame and introduce the event. Dr. Reed will hold the mic for 15 minutes to share some thoughts with us. Gabriel Singer will facilitate a discussion among the three of us. And the fourth quarter, we got a Q&A conversation with the entire group. But let's not miss an opportunity to get to know each other a little bit. Using the chat box function, can you say hello and let us know what organization you are representing today? You might be representing an academic organization. That's the capacity I'm in right now. A research organization, a social service organization. Shit, you might be representing a street organization. If you are representing a street organization today, keep in mind that at least 2 known law enforcement professionals have RSVP'd to attend this event. More importantly, I'm a square, and the majority of us are civilians, so please don't bang on us too hard. Let me ask one more icebreaker question for the group. What do you hope to get out of this meeting? I mean, another way of asking this is, why are you here? But that's not a very welcoming way to frame the question. So please let us know, what do you hope to get out of the hour? Go ahead and write that in the chat box. As you write your intentions for the hour, I'm going to go ahead and continue with my comments. So please go ahead and share that with us, write it out. And you could refer back to this in about 40 minutes. And if you haven't gotten what you came for, please feel encouraged to submit a question in the Q&A box. My name is Dr. Albert de la Tierra. Many of you know me as Professor Lobo. I am a faculty member in the Department of Criminal Justice Studies here at San Francisco State University. With the remainder of my time, I would like to frame and introduce this afternoon's event. Basically, how did we get here? ARCJS and CJ600. I'm gonna give some details for each of these in the next few slides. Here, let me just give y'all a little primer. ARCJS the Annual Review of Criminal Justice Studies is my department's undergraduate scholarly journal. It's a venue for radical thinkers, where authors explore how ideas and systems of crime, law, and justice shape and are shaped by broader issues of social justice, especially those related to the experience of race, class, gender, sexuality, and age inequality in the US. I am the ARCJS founder and faculty advisor. CJ 600 is an upper division course titled Youth Gangs in Community Context. As the title suggests, this course examines youth gangs in America within social, economic, and political contexts. I taught CJ 600 over the summer, and today, this meeting that we're in right now, is our last class activity. So welcome to my classroom, everybody. And for the students in the room, congratulations. You made it through a very difficult, very demanding summer class. I'm gonna hit y'all with a follow-up email asking for donations, but let me give you a brief overview of ARCJS. ARCJS is an intellectual community that brings together some of the brightest students from two campuses on opposite coasts of the United States, San Francisco State University and the John Jay College of Criminal Justice. During the fall semester, students who've been accepted into our cohort program meet weekly for a virtual seminar designed to help them polish their research papers in preparation for the peer review process. During the spring, we have internal as well as public events like this one, finalize the papers, and host a bi-coastal Zoom symposium. We also help students prepare for grad school or whatever is next on their horizon. We launch our volumes every May. Gabriel Singer, who you'll hear more from shortly, is the incoming ARCJS editor-in-chief for the San Francisco State side of things. He's a CJS alum, current master's student in international relations, and a student leader for Project Rebound. CJ 600. I see the university classroom as a place where emerging scholars can and should actively engage with the world around them. I see my students as future leaders and believe they can start making a positive impact now. To that end, I design my courses in a manner that sets students up to do just that. Fuck the ivory tower. You know what I mean? In this summer's CJ 600 class, we labored to deconstruct the prejudiced gaze that criminalizes and pathologizes street organizations that emerge from structurally marginalized and oppressed communities. Over the course of 5 weeks, each of my CJ 600 students completed an original research project that culminated in a 15-page paper. Essentially a case study of their local youth gang, these final papers are comprised of at least 4 major sections. To understand the social, political, and economic forces involved with shaping their neighborhood, students produced a critical social history using various qualitative research methods. Additionally, students conducted critical discourse analyses of news articles and news segments discussing their local youth gang to reveal how dehumanizing discourse serves status quo relations of power that legitimate violent state apparatuses. Highlighting real-life examples, students also challenged the dominant storyline about their youth gang by producing empirically grounded and historically accurate counter-narratives. Lastly, each paper concludes with a powerful call to action. Divide and Conquer was one of the assigned readings for CJ 600. Students read excerpts of the text in a portion of the class titled Unity and Social Change. Accordingly, we read Dr. Reed's introductory chapter, chapter 7, titled The Peacemakers, Resistance and Resilience. And we also read the conclusion. Dr. Robert D. Weide is an associate professor in the Department of Sociology at California State University, Los Angeles. After recognizing that his text had become one of the class favorites, I reached out to him. And with short notice, he generously agreed to volunteer his time and intellectual labor to speak with us about his work. What's more, he's taking time away from a family vacation to be here with us today. So saying thank you, although it's genuine, doesn't totally capture the fullness of my appreciation for your being here. Divide and Conquer: Race, Gangs, Identity, and Conflict is an award-winning book published in 2022 by Rutgers University Press. On page 3, Dr. Weide writes, quote, "An ethnography of gangs in Los Angeles, Divide and Conquer provides a case study in how racialized identities and nationalist ideology function to divide subordinate populations, thereby turning them against one another, the classic divide and conquer stratagem of capitalist labor management." Will you please use the reactions button to join me in applause in welcoming Dr. Robert D. Weide to the microphone?
Yeah, thank you. I actually just got home for vacation, so I'm a little scatterbrained, but I'll try to make some comments and answer whatever questions students may have. So yeah, thank you. It's a Temple University Press, and actually the series is called Studies in Transgression. Has some other really good books about gangs and other similar related issues in critical criminology. And the editor of the series is my mentor and Albert's mentor, David Brotherton at the CUNY Grad Center, John Jay College of Community Justice. Is that right? A long time.
The John Jay College of Criminal Justice.
Yeah. So anyways, my name is Robert. My last name is Weide. I'm a associate professor of sociology at Cal State LA. My PhD is from the Department of Sociology at New York University, which is how I know Albert and David. We were all in New York together, and so yeah, so I wrote this book. It kind of came out of my doctoral dissertation, which if when you go to grad school, for a master's degree, you have to take tests or write a thesis, and for your PhD, you have to conduct some original research that no one's done. So I was trying to think of a topic to do, is a big, your analysis is probably more important, but what topic are you actually going to talk about? And I was thinking about something, that was pertinent for me when I was growing up. I grew up in Los Angeles, and I was a gang member when I was a kid. And among the many experiences I had was there was a very visceral conflict between Black and Latino gangs in Los Angeles. And I had a friend in high school who was murdered as a result of one of these conflicts, these longstanding conflicts, that still intermittently carries on to this day. And so I had an interest in these issues just because of my own personal experience and the opening vignette to the book. Sorry, I know you guys read the last chapter and the conclusion. Did you read the intro too?
We read the intro, chapter 7, and the conclusion.
Okay. So I'll try to keep my comments to that. So my friend who passed away when I was in high school, Eddie Gomez, I kind of tell his story, the story of his murder in the opening vignette. And it was something that was, kind of just assumed part of life when I was growing up, that, Black and brown people have conflict with each other and that there's all this violence in our community and that, any of us could be killed or go to prison at any time. And, having grown up in that world, it just seemed natural to me. I never thought to question it. Until I went to college and went to grad school and got educated and was reading books and books and books and books and books. This is probably only half my books back there. And realized that there's really much bigger structural forces that underlie the conflicts that we have in our communities. In my community, the primary dividing lines were race and gang affiliation. But in communities all around the country and around the world, you see dividing lines, dividing people from one another, turning them against each other, and making it easier for them to be manipulated and exploited, which is the classic divide and conquer strategy, of course. Um, so it was the obvious title for the book. um, and maybe I'll give you a quick synopsis of what you didn't read is, I kind of went through like the history of how the emergence of capitalism created a problem for the economy, and that there's always going to be a group of people who are not absorbed into the regular economy, and that this, what Marx calls the surplus labor population, presents a potential threat to capital because there's this population of superfluous workers who have no stake in the system and who could potentially rebel and even possibly prosecute a revolution against the system. And so capitalism needs to do something with this surplus population to deactivate it so it doesn't become a threat. And race is the primary vehicle for that division, that necessary labor market division, um, within American capitalism. Now, that strategy has been exported around the world. And in some regions, of course, divisions are along, tribal lines or religious lines or what have you. But in the US context, and in many other countries, race is really the primary dividing line that keeps the population divided among themselves conceptually and aligns themselves in opposition to one another. And so that's why the race concept was invented. And so I present the history of that, a short, very concise history, but with citations in case you're interested in reading further into it. And then I discuss the origin of nationalism, which is taking the race concept and projecting it into what we call today identity politics. Right. And so, identity politics is just kind of a newer term for an ethno-nationalist ideology that really finds its, really developed in the 19th century, in Europe and in European in colonies in parts of the world that were colonized by European superpowers. And so in the following chapter, I give a critique of identity politics, not just my own, but I kind of go through maybe not a completely, maybe it's impossible to find every last critique. There's so many, but most of what I consider the major critiques, both historical critiques from the 19th century when nationalist ideology was emerging, but also critiques through the 20th century from the Black Panther Party, for example, and then more contemporary critiques from like the 90s and 2000s. And I also have a chapter talking about, what racial bias looks like in this particular population between Blacks and Latinos, in the particularly Southern California context, and having interviewed 100 right, I think 97 gang members, something like that. I was able to use their, answers and their perspectives to kind of, explain not just what people's, biases are, but what they're founded in and what are the assumptions and how does it all work out? How do people conceptualize it and so forth? And then there was a chapter. Oh, then there's a chapter that talks about that's kind of gives micro, like ethnographic analyses, kind of historical ethnographic descriptions of particular conflicts between particular gangs that have occurred over the years, kind of individual case studies of how these conflicts have played out. And then I think the last chapter that you guys read, which is about how these conflicts have not completely, but in many cases, and certainly in the prison system, have been worked out and mitigated and have been, laid to rest, especially in the prison system, but also on the streets. And so half the chapter talks about uh, the hunger strike that occurred in California prisons and or a series of hunger strikes in 2011 and 2013 were the two major ones. And how something that's titled the Agreement to End Hostilities was devised by people who were leaders of the hunger strike in Pelican Bay State Prison. And it was published in, I think it was like August or October, fall of 2012. And essentially what they did is they came to the realization that, like, whether we're black, brown, or white, whether from Northern California or Southern California, all of the different, major inmate factions and, inmate organizations that represent inmates and help to govern them internally, all came to the same realization that, like, we're all in the same slave ship. Like, we're all in these tombs. We're all going to die in the shoe. We're all in a concrete box. None of us are ever going to get out. And we need to, instead of fighting each other, we need to form like Voltron. Maybe I'm dating myself with that. Voltron is a toy from the 1980s where there was different colored lions, the red lion and the yellow lion and the blue lion and, maybe the brown lion and the black panther or the jaguar and the panther, right? Which actually it's kind of ironic because, the two, animal representations of these communities, the jaguar and the panther are actually the same fucking animal, right? A black panther is just a jaguar with a dark coat. So in any case, um, people in prison realize that, like, we've been turned against each other all these years. This is a strategy that the prison system and really the larger government has used to divide us. And so they, officially published this document, which I've included in its full in that chapter, the full text in that chapter, basically saying that enough is enough, that there will be no more further racial antagonism and, the race riots that people used to experience back in the day in prison and stuff like that. All of that came to an end in 2012, right? And still to this day, the whole racial hostility and race riots and all that that used to be a part of, serving time in California prisons no longer exists anymore, right? The inmates themselves have developed a system to intervene and mitigate conflicts between inmates, particularly across racial lines. Which, on a separate side note, I could give you a whole nother lecture about how they've instituted this new policy of yard integration in order to artificially manufacture violence, because the violence has collapsed so dramatically because inmates have, basically made peace among themselves. And so people on the streets, gang members on the streets, you know, all of us who grew up on the streets, like, basically grow up with the expectation that we're going to go to prison at some time in our life, right? And so, especially youngsters grow up looking up to people in prison. And so people in prison, not, because they have some kind of like military-like authority over people on the streets, but just because of the social, cultural influence that they have, people on the streets are receptive to what people in prison are thinking, right? And so when people in prison said, you know what, we need to bring these conflicts between different races to an end, people on the streets heard that message too. And, there were all of these cases. I detailed one in specific between Florencia and the East Coast Crips, two of the biggest Black and Latino gangs in Los Angeles, that had a long-running conflict for about 20 years, and they were able to come to terms and establish a ceasefire, which still continues to hold to this day. So that chapter kind of gives, concrete examples of how these ceasefire agreements and peace treaties can be prosecuted. And then, of course, in the conclusion, I just kind of reiterate that, all of this identity politics and all of these racial identities and racial conflicts, and, for this particular example between gangs, right? This is all, divide and conquer. They're just trying to turn us against each other so that we think that we're different from one another, when really, like, our lives intersect in myriad of different ways. We're not just in the same prisons, we're in the same schools, in the same universities, we're in the same line at the GR office, we're in the same high schools, we share our lives together completely. the idea that there's something so intrinsically different about us is an idea that has been, intentionally implanted into our consciousness in order to divide us. So why don't now do we open up for questions, or I don't know what the next stage of.
Thank you for that. I'm gonna pin Gabriel. I know that he's gonna share with the group a series of questions that my students submitted in one of their assignments. And then want to hear your thoughts on it, as well as Gabriel's. Gabriel can introduce himself and is also well versed on these topics. So why don't I give it to you, Gabe?
Hey, thank you very much. So my name is Gabriel Singer. I'm a Project Rebound student. I did roughly 16 and a half years of a 21-year sentence. I graduated last year with my bachelor's in criminal justice studies. And I'm also the chief and editor of the ACR, I'll say that again. Albert, you introduced
The
me on that one.
annual the annual review of criminal justice studies.
Thank you.
Recently, with every new group of students, they shorten it in different ways. So we went through a period where people were saying ARCJS, which was not my favorite, but it ended up sticking. And then other people just lay it all out with the acronyms.
Right.
But
Thank you.
right.
I appreciate that. And so some of why I'm at the table here and some of my experiences with this is that 99% of my time was done on a maximum security prison. I spent half my time in the hole, around the politics that this book was written about, and I was also involved in all three of the hunger strikes. So that's a little bit about myself. I'm also a master's student for international relations. And that's it. So do I just go ahead and ask the questions?
Yeah, you want to start with the first one? I can put
Sure.
it up on the screen for the group to be able to see it.
Okay. So all right, so I'm gonna ask this question to Dr. Weide. How can those directly involved in academia become radicalized in community organizations without being complicit? If any, how far would the divide between their positions and the educator and the organizer, and how many they intersect without enabling oppressive forces?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question, and it's an ethical quandary for those of us in academia who have ethics. And it's we first of all we need to recognize what the academy is. The academy is a propaganda wing of the oligarchy, essentially, and that's why the university system was invented in the late Middle Ages as essentially to create propaganda and to produce knowledge that's useful to the state. And so the transition to capitalism and modern nation states, that's only been augmented, and the university, plays a very important part in controlling the population for the oligarchy. And so while those of us with a, social conscience and some sense of, ethics and dignity, might, think that our job is to, fight the powers that be and do good and, change the world for the better, we have to recognize that that's not what, our superiors see our job as. So we're certainly going to, those of us who do stick to our ethics and maintain our dignity, are going to be are going to suffer for it for sure. And so you have to be willing to accept that you're not going to be promoted, you're going to be demoted, or maybe not demoted, but you're not going to receive the support of you're not going to receive institutional support. You're not going to be popularized in the media. You're not going to be you're going to be constantly constantly subjected to discipline and investigations and career assassination attempts and people politicking against you and that sort of thing. So, you just got to eat it basically and do the right thing, do what you know is right. And, And otherwise, you know, at least for me, why the fuck am I doing this? You know, if I was gonna be a Muppet, I would have been a, you know, I would have gone to Wall Street or something and at least made some real money because they don't pay us too much for what we do, let me tell you. Right. Now, the good thing, at least in the Cal State system, you know, currently, I mean, we'll see how things are shaking out, you know, but the Cal State system probably has the safest tenure in the American university system, you know, if not the world. Um, and so, you know, we as Cal State faculty have, you know, quite a bit more leeway in being able to push back against the system than people in more elite universities in the UC system and private schools, where tenure is really just nominal. And anybody, you know, we've certainly seen with people critiquing the Holocaust that Israel's perpetrating in Palestine, if they want to get rid of somebody, they're going to do it, you know. So those of us, you know, depending on what level of tenure protection you might have, you know, like you kind of got to push the line. And, you know, getting yourself fired isn't going to, you know, make you any more effective. But, you know, you got to kind of press and see where that line is and bring yourself as close as you can to it without, you know, without losing the influence that your position does have. You know, we can't all commit revolutionary suicide, and those of us that are fortunate enough to have made it into the academy and can publish and, you know, speak out and things like that, you know, it's much as we'd like to pick up the gun and go fight against the state, you know, ourselves, is, you know, that's not our place in the resistance. You know, the best thing we can do is really to, you know, fight back with our words, you know, the pen, sword, you know, it takes swords to do anything, but it's the pen that moves the sword. So I don't know what else to tell you to encourage you and not to discourage you from trying to do the right thing, but, you know, you've just got to stick to your ethics and try to live a life of dignity and, you know, not be used as a tool by people, you know, who want to destroy people like us.
Thank you for that response. That was a really good response, bro. The next question would be, what do you think it would look like if law enforcement were serious about mitigating racialized gang conflicts and the violence that results?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think the person who wrote that question clearly read the last chapter and the conclusion. You know, so let's say what has law enforcement been doing, right? Law enforcement has for generations now, since the 1970s, has been pursuing this policy they call the kingpin strategy, which is to attack the structure of so-called criminal organizations, right? And I argued in another article that policy actually exacerbates violence and crime. It doesn't mitigate it. You know, by cutting the head off the snake, you don't kill the snake, you create a hydra, right? And it multiplies the violence. And so the last chapter of this book is, you know, is kind of piggy-legged off that article. I didn't actually cite the article in the book because they were both published at the same time. Neither had been published yet when they were both submitted. The article is called Structural Disorganization, and it's in the academic journal Critical Criminology. But basically, that article kind of gives the a theoretical framework and an example, and the book gives, you know, a better example of that. You know, gang members, you know, the people we're told are terrorists and, you know, incorrigible criminals and so forth, actually themselves act to mitigate violence and conflict, right? And so they intervene in their own conflicts and they settle their own conflicts, and it's the structure that criminalized organizations provide actually mitigates violence. You know, violence is more pronounced in cases where there is what I term structural disorganization, where there is no structure among criminalized communities to intervene and mitigate in their conflicts. Good example of that is New Orleans, which has a persistent high homicide rate, and there are no gangs in New Orleans, right? Um, so, um, what's law enforcement's response been to that? Is to target the people who are intervening to mitigate the violence, to cast them as racketeers and, part of some kind of grand criminal conspiracy, and to target them either individually or in groups to remove them from a position of being able to communicate effectively to intervene in conflicts, right? So the state actually actively undermines peace efforts that are made by gang members themselves, right? So what would it look like if law enforcement, was interested in mitigating violence instead of exacerbating it, right? Well, if law enforcement truly wanted to mitigate violence, they wouldn't be targeting the people who are trying to promote peace and trying to intervene in conflicts. They would be targeting people who are the bad actors, who are perpetuating violence and refusing to come to the table to negotiate and to come to terms, right? But that's not, it's what law enforcement done is actually the opposite of that, right? So it's not really, they're not really hiding it. We've seen the prosecutions, we've seen all the people, who've been in the lead of making these, historic peace agreements, and we've seen them all charged in these cockamamie RICO cases and conspiracy cases and whatnot in the ensuing years. That's not a coincidence.
Based on your own past affiliations with our group, do you believe other marginalized groups can build similar trust with the community that systematic forces have labeled as unsafe? Oh, there's another section. Sorry, there's a second part to that. Yeah.
But I think you're right. They are two separate questions. Can you put it back up there so I can see the first one? I was trying to figure out if I can give one grand answer to both, but I don't think so. Yeah, I mean, the case studies that I give in the book are about gangs in California prisons and Los Angeles, right? And that's just the case study, right? So an academic book, may be about a specific topic and about a specific community or field site, but that doesn't mean that the analysis only applies to that specific, community. The idea is that you take the analysis and you apply it to other parts of the world, right, where you find similar, similar divisions and conflicts going on. So the kind of the blueprint that I have for in the book for how, how conflict was, how interventions were made to end conflicts and to mitigate violence in California prisons and in Los Angeles, right? Those same strategies and that same analysis and that same perspective can be, applied to other parts of the world where you find similar types of conflicts between populations over lines of identity.
Must someone have a past affiliation to fully understand the challenge and category labels?
Yeah, so that's a methodological question. Does someone have to have been a participant in what they're observing as a researcher in order to formulate, a useful analysis? I would say no, right? And I would say that, there are people who live the life whose analysis is all fucked up. Right? Uh, just because someone had certain experiences or didn't, that's separate. That's a separate issue from whether they can arrive at an analysis that I would agree with. Right? So there's, some people who've had similar experiences as me who we see eye to eye. And, but there's also people who haven't had experiences that I had that we also see eye to eye. So it's really not, I wouldn't say that that's the defining factor. Now, methodologically, do people who have had those experiences have some advantage, in terms of, there are some advantages in terms of, interpreting the data when you're out there hanging out in the neighborhood, and people are talking about shit, or you're observing people do things, or you're having conversations with people. Someone who's familiar, who has the cultural capital to, be familiar and well versed in that particular community, right, is going to be in a lot better position to interpret what's being said and understand, what's going on, and so forth, right? I don't think anybody can argue against that. But can someone who's from outside the community come in, live there, genuinely become a part of the community and gain that cultural capital? Of course, that's certainly possible as well. Can someone who, there's a lot of researchers, I won't name any names, who don't actually ever step foot in the community themselves, except just to start the project. And then they send grad students to do their interviews for them and to collect all their data and so forth. Now, are they going to have the same ability to come up with an analysis? Obviously, they're going to be at a disadvantage, I would say. But, if you haven't been a gang member, but you're interested in, studying gangs, I would say go for it, but, be earnest in what you do and be genuine and be a part of the community. Don't just be some, vulture that comes in and grabs what they need and flies off.
And the last question, what role can gang truth organizers play in a broader movement, and what challenges do they face in being taken seriously?
Um, yeah, I mean, I think that, I make the argument in the book that gangs within contemporary American society, gangs have the most potential for forming the nucleus, the so-called vanguard of a revolutionary movement. Gangs are armed and experienced in violence, which is necessary in a revolution, unfortunately. And gang members in our system, because we have such an incredibly high incarceration rate, it's kind of funny that American oligarchy has dug themselves a hole by putting so many people in prison. Going to prison, doesn't have the threat that it once did. Most people who grew up in working class neighborhoods, particularly people who grew up in the streets, expect to go to prison and don't fear it, right? And many people in prison have no expectation of ever getting out and don't really care, right? And that's a very dangerous population who can't be intimidated by the threat of going to prison, right? Now, what are uh, uh, what are gang members missing? Where are they lacking in potential is clearly in their, political education and analysis. Right? If if they had read all these books, there would be a revolution and gang members would be assassinating members of the American oligarchy, they'd be chasing them around the world and so forth, but it's propaganda, the state uses propaganda to influence the way people think. And of course, the university plays an important role in that. And I talked about in the book, the role that ethnic studies, in particular, has played in this divide and conquer strategy, by promoting identity politics, encouraging people to think of themselves as being intrinsically different from one another. But it's not just the university promoting these ideas. It's in the media. It's in the movies our kids watch. Black kids are supposed to watch Black Panther and think that they're the king of Wakanda, and Mexican kids are supposed to, watch Coco and, think about getting a chancla thrown at them by the abuelita, right? Uh, it's everywhere. It's in their clothes, the way people dress, the music people listen to, the food that people eat, the places people go to socialize are all chosen on the basis of these, ephemeral identities that we think are so important in our lives. And so, every aspect of our society encourages us to embrace the idea that there's something different about ourselves from one another, even if we live right fucking next door to each other.
May I ask a follow-up question to that?
Yeah.
do you think the state plays a big part in creating a lack of resources to read those books in the back when you get incarcerated? And so they
I mean,
don't.
you've been to prison. It's funny which
Yep.
books get through, right?
Yeah.
All those, books about, the Mexica and how to learn Nahuatl and, Swahili and, all these nationalist books somehow get through, right? But then the actual revolutionary books don't. What does that tell you? You know what I mean? Like prisoners have these, I mean, still, even with the peace treaties, prisoners identify themselves in racial groups, no doubt. To this day, that's not going anywhere, right? But where did they get that from? Did they come up with that themselves? No. During the civil rights movement, people on the streets were coming up with these ideas and publishing books and getting tenure track jobs in university system, and the material that they were writing and producing and the ideas that people and the slogans people were chanting in the streets, well, that all filtered its way into prison. And so people in prison, took on these, racialized identities, in the same during the civil rights era, same as they emerged in the streets, right? Um, but um, but it's funny that it's in prison that people first started to realize, wait a minute, hold up, we're all, they haven't gone so far as to jettison the actual racial identities, but they've realized that the racial identities are being used to turn them against one another. So they explicitly said, you know what, we're not putting an end to the identities. I'm not getting all my Mexica tattoos. I'm not getting my war shield, covered up. Right. But at the same time, they said, we're not going to fight over this anymore. Right. We're going to end the war. Right. So it opens a new question. Is it possible to retain the identities, but not have the division? Time will tell, right? The California prison system's a great field study for that, right? Will racial, conflicts reemerge? Will the peace treaties break down eventually? If not, then maybe it is possible to retain the identities and end the conflict. But, I think, in the long term, as long as these identities are central to our existence, they will always, it's like gas that's waiting to be lit, right? It will always, the potential will always be there for outside actors to manipulate us into conflict with one another.
Yeah, I agree. The ever-growing banned book list of CDCR.
Which my book is. My book hasn't gotten into it hasn't got into LA County, and it hasn't got into CDCR. It's always been kickback.
Thank you, Gabriel. Thank you, Bobby. We have a few minutes left in the scheduled call, and I want to turn it over to the folks who are here in the participants list. If anybody has questions for Dr. Vida, I always say your name wrong. My bad in the beginning. I was getting it wrong. But if anybody has questions, you can ask them, or you can write them in the chat box.
Or critiques.
Or critiques.
I welcome your critiques.
I have a series of other questions students had submitted in advance, but I want to prioritize the folks who are here with us right now.
Yeah, I see what you're saying. I see what you're asking. Yeah. And first of all, I think you have to meet people where they are, like, people, anybody who's been to jail or prison, everybody in there is, in their mind, whether we like it or not, we're in one box or another, right? You're, by race or by area or whatever. So that's not going to go away overnight, by any means. And there's been generations of propaganda, from the university and the media and, every other aspect of life to establish and maintain that. There's probably only a handful of people in the world that even have my perspective that this is the wrong route, to liberation. And how can we go up against against $1 billion propaganda industry, $1 trillion propaganda industry, whatever it is. But I mean, I only have one life to live, and I'm spending it, writing this book and trying to convince people that, that our parents went down the wrong road, and back in the 60s and the 70s, and and that there's another route out of this. And but you know, all I can do is hope to put those ideas out there, and maybe, you know, maybe they'll catch on with someone. You know, all I can do is plant the seed, you know, and hope that it grows. And maybe, maybe not for this generation, or maybe for the next one, but you know, if you publish a book, and you disseminate some ideas, you never know when they'll, when they'll fall in the right pot and grow into something. You know, some of the, authors who've had the most influence on me conceptually, lived 150 years ago, and nobody really cared what they wrote since then. And then I, by some miracle or mistake, found what they wrote, and it opened my mind, so you never know. Another good example, actually, from the hunger strike itself. Where did the idea of the hunger strike in the prisons come from? A sociology professor like myself from upstate New York sent someone in prison a book about a hunger strike in Ireland. And, thinking, oh, send it to a white inmate, thinking, oh, he'll probably want to read it because it's about Ireland, and maybe that was the impetus for him to read it, or maybe he was just stuck in the shoe and would read any fucking book anyone would send him. And, read this book about this IRA hunger strike, and, started yelling down the tier, hey, you guys got to read this book. This is what we should do. Right? You never know, the impact that an idea can have if it's put in the right pot. So I don't know what else I can do.
Thank you for that. Can you answer the question that's in the chat, and then we'll start going to the closing comments? For the recording, the chat question reads, what are your thoughts on youth receiving mental health services in youth detention centers? Is it still a stigma? Is it safe to reach out for help? I think
Yeah, and also I
couple
can
of
stay
ways.
on as long as you'd like me to keep talking. I have no other prior engagements today, but yeah. So I don't talk about mental health services and youth detention in the book, but I can certainly give you my opinion on it, which is that there's a trend in society to cast social problems as psychological problems. And so and we call this the pathological perspective within criminology, which is rooted in the work of 19th century Italian criminologist named Gina Cesare Lombroso. And this is unmistakably a very right-wing perspective within criminology, even though people in in the field of psychology and social services and mental health, don't recognize it as such. But by casting social problems like crime as a mental health issue, we focus our attention and our blame on the individual who engages in those behaviors, right? And we pretend that it's some kind of psychological issue with them, that if that can be fixed, then we can, save them from themselves and turn them into a law-abiding member of society, right? But really, social psychology has taught us that the psychological issues that we experience as individuals are the product of social circumstances that are beyond our control, right? Our agency only goes so far. So, we can, I certainly think that we all, those of us who grew up in the streets, and certainly people who've been to prison, have suffered unspeakable trauma and have psychological issues and need mental health services for their own personal growth. But I do not think that that's a solution to crime or any other social problem. The root causes go much deeper than our own individual psychology. Um, Now, as far as, is it a stigma, or is it safe for them? This goes by institution. Some institutions are becoming a bit more progressive and are providing mental health services to youth. I can think of a couple. I have some grad students that are, provide services to youth that are in detention, or either awaiting trial or convicted, but are too young to be transferred. to adult prison. And so there are some good programs that are, kind of providing mental health services to all the wards in their care so that there's no stigma attached. But I'm sure there are, other institutions that are more, draconian, where there is a stigma among the inmates because it's something that's, not provided for all of the the wards that are in the care of the institution. So it's, I'm not an expert on that, so I couldn't tell you which institutions are good and which are bad. I only know anecdotally, a few that I've heard of, one way or the other. But uh, I hope that answer goes a little bit deeper than the question you intended.
Thank you for that one. You have one more question in the chat, and thanks for the extra time with us.
Yeah, someone asked
Asking,
which authors. Well, they're all in the book. Well, maybe not all of them, but a lot of them. I'd say if there's one person that that really changed my thinking more than anyone else, it was Mikhail Bakunin, which is probably someone that no one here's ever heard of before, right? And then you have to ask yourself, well, why is that? It was someone that I had never heard of. I went to UC Santa Barbara for undergrad and went to NYU and got a PhD, and I'd never heard this name, and that's not an accident. Mikhail Bakunin is one of the founders of the anarchist framework of socialist theory, and was actually an opponent of Karl Marx's during their lifetime, and was much more well regarded and had a much larger following than Marx did during their lifetime. And only after the Russian Revolution, Marx became popular. Um, so uh, I'd suggest you go out and find Mikhail Bakunin books and look him up online. The book that really changed, it's actually funny, the way I found him was on Facebook of all places. Someone had posted a meme with a Bakunin quote and a picture of him, and he was this big giant bear of a man. And I thought, and I liked the quote, and I was like, who the hell is this? I never heard of this guy before. So I Googled it, and I just read the Wikipedia, and I was like, damn, this dude sounds fucking pretty badass. He spent his whole life, he was like a revolutionary. He traveled all over Europe trying to promote revolutions and to participate in revolutions, and spent a decade in prison and so on and so forth. The book that I read is called Statism and Anarchy. And what really makes his perspective so much more effective as a framework for liberation than Marx's was, is that he not only has a critique of capitalism, but also of nationalism. And really, nationalism and capitalism are, are a tag team duo, right? That make the world that we live in possible. And Marx, paid short shrift to nationalism, and that's why Marx's ideas have been adapted so easily by nationalist movements, nationalist so-called liberation movements around the world, particularly in the so-called third world, because Marx you know, didn't didn't really critique capitalism the way Bakunin had. So
thank you so much for answering those questions, for the extra time, for being here with us today. I'm gonna start closing this down. I got a little fly, sorry. All right, everybody. I want to share contact info for the folks on the call who don't know me through the university. This is how you can find me. Thank you for being here. Thank you for supporting our students, for supporting the annual review of criminal justice studies. And thank you again for Dr. Weide for being here. If you can all join me in one final applause, and please feel free to reach out if you want to get connected with him. If you want, you could put your email in the chat, Dr. Weide, or folks can reach out
oh,
to
yeah.
me and then I can
Yeah,
forward that
if you
message.
guys can hit up Albert, but I'll put
Yeah, that'll be
I
perfect.
my email is actually not on our Cal State LA webpage because I get too many death threats.
Terrible.
So there's
All
my
right,
email
y'all.
right there if anybody
Okay,
wants.
great. Great. For the folks who are in the meeting, you can find his email in the chat. For people watching the recording, you'll have to reach out to me, and then I could forward the message if it's appropriate and not a death threat.
Okay.
All right,
Salute.
y'all.
Thank you for your
I'm gonna
time.
log off. I'll text both of you, Gabe and Bobby, after I log this off. Peace, everybody.